Hey guys, how's it going? Cyclical here, coming at you with another Naruto discussion video. Now, as promised in my first video, this is going to be my attempt at power scaling and ranking the Akatsuki. The reason I wanted to start with such an enormous task is threefold. Now, first of all, this is an extremely popular topic, and as such, it's one where I disagree with a lot of the takes people have made over the several years people have been exploring this topic. As such, I expect I won't just be parroting the opinions of those I've heard over the years, even though I have kept up with the discussion. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that you can expect a few hot takes in this video. Secondly, this is a pretty deep topic to discuss, so I thought that if I could accomplish doing this as only the second video on my channel, it should set me up pretty well to take on any other discussions that might come up. And lastly, I just wanted to do this because it seemed fun. And, well, the Akatsuki are one of my favorite groups in all of fiction. I don't want to get into a habit of over-introducing my videos going forward, but I do think there's a few things I need to go over before I jump into this one. The first of which is that in concert with my first video, I'll be attempting to rank the members of the Akatsuki in the most logically consistent way that I can. This is going to be difficult because, for as good as an author as Kishimoto is, he did a pretty poor job of making it clear just how broad the power scale is in Naruto. Now, for example, and especially relevant to this list, I think that the general level of power is much narrower than it appears to be, meaning that characters who seem far removed from each other in the manga/anime in terms of power may actually be rivaling each other in terms of overall strength. Another thing that makes this difficult is that each character's arsenal, especially in this group, is pretty unique and won't often boil down to just determining which character is more physically powerful than the others. So in taking this approach, I'm already forced to answer a pretty big question, and that's what I mean when I say that one member of the Akatsuki is more powerful than the others. So I'll be ranking them based on the following criteria. 1. How does the presentation of a given character through the tone of the story and the rumors we hear about them from other characters affect our impression of their overall strength? 2. How do their feats we see stack up in comparison to the hype they've received? And 3. Is there any external evidence or retroactive storytelling that we can incorporate into the analysis of a given character while we attempt to power scale them? In general, I think that the members of the Akatsuki should be on a relatively similar level of power, except in cases that I will make obvious as we get further into the video. But in cases where I think two characters are incredibly similar in strength, I will probably just rank them based on who I think would beat the other in a one-on-one fight. The next thing I need to mention is that I will only be ranking the mainline Akatsuki members, so no members of Taka, no Orochimaru, no filler characters or subordinates like Kabuto, and no Zetsu. No Taka because I don't feel like they were involved enough in the organization to warrant me ranking them alongside the main members. No Orochimaru because I want to make some videos about the Sannin in the near future, and I'll save analyzing him until then. No side characters because most of them aren't even strong enough to really say anything interesting about, and that's in the rare case that I could even find enough to talk about them anyway. And lastly, no Zetsu just because, well, I really don't like the guy. The final thing I need to touch on before I jump into my list is that I'll obviously try to be as objective as I can going through this list, but I do have biases just like any other person, and they will be at play, at least on a subconscious level. If I notice my bias creeping in and in a way that I think I really can't move past, I'll be sure to point it out, but for the most part, I don't think it'll be a big issue. And if you're going to leave a comment, I only ask that you keep it respectful. So with all of that out of the way, grab a snack, get comfortable, because we are going to be here for a while. So starting off the list at number 9, we have Hidan. I said I've got some hot takes, and I promise I will get to them, but in the meantime, I can't ignore the simple truth that Hidan is the weakest member of the Akatsuki, and he's nowhere near on par with the other members. Remember a minute ago when I was saying that the Akatsuki are mostly rivaling each other in power except for a few? Well, Hidan is the first of those exceptions. Since I don't think I'm really rocking the boat with this pick, or even really adding much to the discussion by explaining why he's at the bottom of the list, I'll quickly go over the evidence I have as to why he's the weakest member of the Akatsuki. There's obviously the statement from Hidan himself that he is the slowest and least accurate member of the entire group, and also that he relies on Kakuzu to do most of the hard work on their missions. But putting those things aside, there's also his really poor track record of feats that we see in his fights. He loses a fight to Asuma in their first encounter, and he has to have his head sewn back on by Kakuzu, which means he would have outright died against a squad of mostly Chunin and one high Jonin level fighter. Then, in the only other fight we see him in, Hidan is completely incapable of even touching Kakashi, who is also being attacked and distracted by multiple of Kakuzu's masks. All of this together puts Hidan optimistically on the high end of Jonin, and due to the fact that he was also beat in a fight by a Chunin, I'd scale him even lower than that. The guy can't even use ninjutsu or genjutsu, and before you jump down to the comments about what I just said about him losing to a Chunin, I know that Shikamaru had knowledge of his abilities and time to make a plan. But the same thing's true for Hidan. In fact, I'd argue it's even worse in Hidan's case, because not only did he know what the Shadow Possession Jutsu was and how to avoid it, but Shikamaru doesn't even have much else in his arsenal, which most likely speaks to the fact that Hidan probably just isn't very smart either. But like I said, he's the weakest member of the Akatsuki, and I feel like I don't even need to try very hard to defend this claim, so I'm just going to move on to number 8. I'm probably dooming myself to a war in the comment section with my pick for number 8, where I've placed Kakuzu. Now look, I know this is going to make several of you mad just hearing this, but I can defend his placement on this list just like I'll be able to defend the rest of my hot takes, so just hear me out before you tear me a new one in the comments. But yeah, Kakuzu's down at second to last, and let's get right into why. So I think the first thing I need to do is to address the statements we have about Kakuzu. There's, of course, the statement that the last Leaf Shinobi he fought before the arc that we see him in was Hashirama. But honestly, this doesn't mean anything. Since we never see them fight, and because I hope nobody actually thinks the two are anywhere near each other in strength, we can safely assume that Hashirama won that fight and probably wasn't even trying to kill Kakuzu. What doesn't help about this statement is that it's so vague that it could range from anywhere from Hashirama almost killing Kakuzu to the two of them being like on the same battlefield as each other for only a few seconds, and we really have no way of knowing. So given how little this gives us to go on, I'm going to declare this statement inadmissible as evidence to our analysis. It's some cool lore, but it has no real impact. Then there's the statements that Kakuzu is one of the Akatsuki's deadliest members. Now, first off, I'm pretty sure this statement comes from one of the data books, so already I can make a case as to why it shouldn't mean much, and that's that the data book statements are mostly just there to hype different characters up and not really be taken literally. If you don't believe me that the statements in the data books are unreliable, just look up a few and see how much they seem to contradict the sense of power progression you're supposed to get from this series. But even if you don't outright dismiss this claim, there's a good reason to believe that it doesn't mean Kakuzu is more powerful than the other members of the Akatsuki. This statement could be referring directly to Kakuzu's physical attack power, which, as I'll get into in a minute, is one of his strong suits. However, just having a more punishing physical attack than that of the other members of the Akatsuki doesn't necessarily make him a better shinobi than the others. Moving on to the last statement I want to address about Kakuzu, we have the somewhat meta statement from Kishimoto about how he wanted to make the fight against Kakuzu longer and more elaborate, which would almost certainly have made him seem more powerful than he was in the series. I can't speak to the validity of this statement's existence, but even if you want to use it in a discussion about Kakuzu, you should acknowledge the subtext of what's being said here. In saying that Kakuzu was intended to be stronger than he turned out to be, it means that he was weaker than intended. Like it or not, the fact of the matter is that Kakuzu was not as powerful a character as originally intended, and that's the final version we got in the series. So moving on to Kakuzu's power, I do have some impressive feats to go over. He possesses all 5 of the basic nature transformations, and he can combine jutsu from each nature to augment them and make some truly devastating combinations. In fact, just one attack from his wind style mask was enough to blow up a pretty sizable chunk of the forest that the fight was taking place in. And the combined fire and wind style mask attack seems to be giving even Kakashi a hard time. He was physically powerful enough to overpower Choji, a member of the Akimichi clan who, in addition to being repeatedly praised for his physical strength, was also using the partial expansion jutsu at the time, which should have made him even stronger. He was fast enough to keep up with Kakashi in a taijutsu scuffle while Kakashi's Sharingan was active, and even managed to almost blow away the Ino Shikacho team on more than one occasion. Heck, at one point, he even had Kakashi on the ropes and seemed just about to kill him until Shikamaru tricked Hidan into stabbing one of Kakuzu's hearts. This brings me to the final point I'll make about Kakuzu, which is that his durability is nothing to scoff at. I'm sure most of you already know a good deal about his durability since it's a meme at this point, but for the sake of being thorough, I'll mention a bit of it. He has 5 hearts, which all need to be destroyed before Kakuzu can actually be killed. He also has the diamond hardening technique, which was able to allow him to survive multiple attacks from a fully manifested tailed beast. So even if a shinobi is fast enough to land a hit on him, there's no guarantee that he'll go down because of it. So if I have all of this positive stuff to make Kakuzu seem so impressive, then why do I have him so far down the list? Well, simply put, I think that he's just not as impressive as the other members of the Akatsuki. He's capable of outputting a lot of destructive force, but anyone who can dodge his attacks will be just fine in a fight against him. He has some good jutsu to increase his durability, but if you can get around it either by speed blitzing him or hitting him with a jutsu he can't resist, it's not like his skin is some sort of super armor or anything. In fact, his actual skin was pierced by a regular needle, and it's not like you can train your organs to get stronger either. So if someone manages to strike one of his organs inside his Earth Grud jutsu or whatever it's called, he will definitely take some major damage. Then lastly, I need to go over Kakuzu's extremely lackluster speed. You'd expect him to have some good speed feats to go with his fighting style, but he just doesn't. For starters, there's an instance during the fight with Asuma in which Kakuzu attempts to sneak attack Shikamaru to disrupt his Shadow Possession Jutsu on Hidan. Now, he does succeed in breaking the jutsu, but Shikamaru, who isn't even all that fast a character in the first place, manages to dodge this attack despite being within melee range of Kakuzu, off guard, and focused on maintaining a jutsu that requires his concentration to maintain. Kakuzu was also slow enough to get tagged by an extremely fatigued base Naruto who had been training non-stop for the last several days, and what's more, he gets tagged by this same Naruto 2 times in the span of like a minute. When Shikamaru controls Hidan with the Shadow Possession Jutsu, Kakuzu struggles to dodge the incredibly predictable attacks being thrown at him, and I'm pretty sure there's even one point in the fight where Choji is able to briefly keep up with him in hand-to-hand. All in all, since Kakuzu isn't some sort of like freak of nature like many of the people going forward are, I'm kind of forced to put him all the way down here. If you really wanted to argue a case for him, I could see switching his position with the person I have above him, but I really couldn't possibly put him any higher than 7th place. So before I move on, I'll leave off with this. Using Kakashi should be a decent metric of comparison with several of the Akatsuki members. Kakashi isn't as powerful as most of the group, but he has the versatility to keep up with and possibly even outmaneuver several of the group's members. In Kakuzu's case, it's basically confirmed that Kakashi could have taken care of Kakuzu by just using his Mangekyo Sharingan, which he didn't have active during the fight. Given that Kakashi had to also watch out for Ino and Choji for most of the fight, and was also being pressured by Hidan for a good portion of it, it's safe to say that Kakuzu would probably lose a one-on-one with Kakashi, and I can even imagine a scenario where Kakashi takes out both Hidan and Kakuzu by himself. And that's something I can't see being said for any of the other characters on this list. I'll move on now to my number 7 pick with everyone's favorite puppet master, Sasori of the Red Sand. Here I am again with another hot take, and I feel I'm going to have to try even harder to convince everyone that despite how impressive Sasori is as a shinobi, he isn't at the top of the Akatsuki's pecking order. I will mention, though, that this is the part of the list where the power level of the characters starts to get really close together for a while, so if you don't agree with me, I totally understand. So, starting again with lore, we run into a similar problem to the one we had with Kakuzu, and that's that Sasori's lore is hard to use to power scale him. He claims himself that he took down an entire country with his performance of 100 jutsu, which sounds incredibly badass on paper. But if you look a bit deeper into this statement, you realize that it doesn't actually mean anything, once again. This is because no other characters are able to confirm this statement, and while I don't assume that Sasori is lying when he says this, the possibility is there that due to a lack of anyone validating his claim, he could be lying. And even if it is true, it's entirely possible and even likely, I would say, that whatever country this was had next to no military influence, since we don't know which country it was and we never hear another character mention it, so it probably wasn't very significant. There's also the lore that Sasori killed the third Kazekage in battle, which we do know is true because he has the man's corpse as a puppet. Once again, though, this can only be used to scale him as high as being about as strong as Gaara was. I don't say this to intentionally downplay him, but the only information we know about the third Kazekage is that he was supposedly the strongest of all of the Kazekage, at least at this point in the series. There's also the claim that the third Kazekage was the strongest shinobi in the entire Land of Wind, but we know that this can't be true since he lost to Sasori. So using only this feat, we can't really get a clear picture of how strong Sasori is supposed to be. We can at least examine how the series treats Sasori while he's on screen, and to be fair to him, the audience is expected to treat Sasori as a pretty large threat. For starters, we know that he should be strong because he's paired with a man who took down one of the 5 Kage without much difficulty. Then Sasori himself effortlessly takes out Kankuro, a Jonin, less than a day later. The tone of the series is pretty bleak anytime he fights against someone too, since we know that he packs his super deadly poison with him at all times, which is what very nearly kills Kankuro and ends their fight in a matter of seconds. On top of this, during the entire fight against Chiyo and Sakura, the audience could be expected to believe that either one of these two women could die at almost any moment. This sense of implied danger is quite a bit more serious than Hidan and Kakuzu managed to exude, who, despite actually killing a named character, the audience can feel pretty confident that Shikamaru's team can beat the two in their second encounter. Getting into Sasori's feats, and we unfortunately don't have a lot to go on here since he's really only involved in one fight. What we do see from him is pretty intense, though. During his fights, we see that Sasori is fast enough to contend with 2 opponents at the same time, one of whom has some of the most extensive battle experience in the whole series. His attacks are threatening enough that it seems like Sakura and Chiyo are both only a single mistake away from death throughout the entire fight. Whether it be against the Hiruko shell, the third Kazekage puppet, or Sasori's body itself. We see the performance of 100 jutsu in this fight here, and to say that that is one of the craziest jutsu in the entire series would be a total understatement. Once again, I think I don't need to explain why Sasori is a strong ninja, but rather why I have him in the bottom half of the Akatsuki. Well, the first thing to his detriment is that no matter how much people these days try to defend it, he did lose his fight against Sakura and Chiyo. I know that the two of them had basically the best matchup possible against him, but at this point in the series, Sakura is still only a Chunin, and Chiyo, who I will argue was never even Sandin level to begin with, is well past her prime here and hasn't been active as a ninja in years. It's also not a fair argument to say that he only lost because he was holding back, since throughout almost the entire fight, the context of the scenes makes it pretty clear that he is trying hard to kill Sakura and Chiyo. I think it's far more likely that his lapse in conviction only applies to the actual last attack of the fight, where he gets distracted by the fact that Chiyo's using the mother and father puppets to attack him. This is a pretty bad look for him considering who we're comparing his power to here, and on that note, his power is one of the more lacking things about him. I know I called his attacks dangerous already, and they are, but most of the danger in his fighting style actually comes from his poison. Most of the puppet weapons aren't particularly threatening, and even his elemental jutsu he pulls from the scrolls on his back don't compare to others we see in the series. His fire style attack in particular seems like it might be dangerous, since it keeps Sakura and Chiyo pinned down for a good while. But if we compare it to Sasuke in part 1, we see that Sasori's fire style only begins to heat the rock it's hitting to red hot, whereas Sasuke's dragon flame jutsu he uses against Naruto in the Valley of the End fight actually melts the rock they're on to lava. Most of the Iron Sand attacks are either slow enough to be dodged by Sakura or non-threatening enough to simply be punched away by her, and once again, she is still only a Chunin. Using Kakashi as a metric again, you can pretty easily make a case that Kakashi outshines Sasori in terms of elemental jutsu. And I don't even need to use Kakashi from like the War arc or even the Kazekage retrieval arc. I'll be using the elemental jutsu feats from the Land of Waves to scale Kakashi here. Compared with Sasori's water jet jutsu, we get a direct comparison when Kakashi uses both the water dragon jutsu and the giant vortex jutsu in his first fight with Zabuza, and both of these seem more impressive than the water style that Sasori uses. Once again, that's the first arc of the show, and Sasori is in Shippuden. Unfortunately, we don't see Kakashi use any fire style in the Land of Waves, but given what he can accomplish just by copying water style and later on when he uses the lightning blade, I feel confident when I say that Sasori's elemental jutsu he uses aren't even all that impressive for a Jonin. Obviously though, these aren't the main part of his arsenal, and continuing on, I think it's still pretty easy to imagine a scenario wherein Kakashi winds up fighting Sasori instead of Chiyo and Sakura. And in a hypothetical situation like this, I think it's also easy to imagine that Kakashi with his Sharingan active would be able to dodge most, if not all of, Sasori's attacks and counter with his own jutsu. The lightning blade should be strong enough to take out the stronger puppets like the Hiroko shell and the third Kazekage puppet, and if things get really dire for Kakashi, we see him use Kamui for the first time in this same arc. And so it's also easy to imagine a situation in which Kakashi could beat Sasori through the use of the Mangekyo Sharingan. In terms of being above Kakuzu, I do think it's more likely that Kakashi would have more of a struggle here and that he may even get poisoned out or outright lose a fight against Sasori. But I think that the other members of the Akatsuki generally would perform better against an opponent like this, so I'm going to remain pretty firm in leaving Sasori down in 7th place. If you really wanted to be generous to him, I could see an argument for him being as high as 5th place on this list, but once again, my own opinion is that he belongs down here. Now at 6th place, I have Kisame. I'm not even sure how to begin this section since the general opinion lately seems to be that Kisame is definitely the 4th strongest man in the Akatsuki, and that he's a good deal stronger than those weaker than him. I used to think the same way until recently, but obviously I don't agree anymore, and here's why. When we look at Kisame, we actually finally have a character in the Akatsuki with a good amount of feats and usable lore. I'm not going to go over Kisame's lore here because I want to focus more on explaining why his feats aren't as incredible as people claim. So to start out, I want to debunk the idea that a 30% power clone of Kisame forced Guy to open to the 6th gate to be able to beat him. I don't blame people for getting the wrong idea about the outcome of this fight, but unfortunately for Kisame, this isn't as good a showing as people think it is. For starters, we need to look at the broader context of the scene, which is that Guy was fighting under a double time constraint here. Not only was Team Guy trying to catch up to Team 7 to assist with rescuing Gaara, but Guy's team had also been caught in a water prison jutsu by Kisame's clones, and so Guy had to act fast in order to prevent Tenten from suffocating. In fact, at the start of the fight, before Tenten starts losing her breath, Guy still hasn't opened any of the inner gates and seems to be doing just fine against this 30% clone of Kisame. He matches him in a taijutsu class, disarms Kisame, and even fights underwater against the 5 hungry sharks jutsu. It's then that he notices Tenten start to suffocate and thinks to himself that he needs to end the fight right away. Being surrounded by a gaggle of sharks, he decides to open to the 6th gate specifically so that he can use the Asakujaku, and the moment he does this, he wins the fight. It's not any more of a contest, Guy isn't pressured at all after this, nothing like that. He just opens the 6th gate and wins the fight. I don't know if Guy would have won without any of the gates open here, but the 6th gate was certainly more than he needed to take the W here. The next showing we get from Kisame is much later on in Shippuden when he fights against Killer Bee, and now this fight is much more impressive for Kisame, though there is the argument that he only did so well in this fight because he was able to get so much stronger off of Bee's chakra. But yeah, in this fight we do get to see Kisame just absolutely tear through Bee. He isn't really keeping up with Bee's speed until he gets in the water and fuses with Samehada, but this doesn't matter because of the way he's able to steal Bee's chakra and tank most of his attacks. Then, to Kisame's credit, He doesn't actually lose this fight either, like some people think he does, because he switches out with a Zetsu clone before the end of the fight so that he can start spying on B. This is definitely his best showing in the series, though once again, it's important to remember that he likely was more powerful than he would have been due to having absorbed B's chakra. And now we get into the big boy battle, which is Kisame versus 7th Gate Guy. This is the battle that a lot of people cite as evidence that Kisame should be on another level from the rest of the Akatsuki below him, but I'll explain why this isn't necessarily the case. A lot of people seem to think that Kisame put up a good fight against Guy in the 7th Gate, but honestly, not much happens here. Just like with the battle against Kisame's clone, Guy decides to open to the 7th Gate, not to deal with Kisame's own strength, but to overwhelm the army of 1,000 sharks that Kisame summoned to try and escape with the scroll of intel he gathered while spying. Guy could not allow this scroll to get away, and so he needed to destroy all 1,000 of the sharks, which is something he couldn't do with just the Asakujaku. So he opens to the 7th Gate, launches Hiradora, and the fight ends just like that. I'm not glossing over any of the fight here either. Like, seriously, go read or watch it again. I promise it's way shorter than you remember it is. This leads me into why I've placed Kisame at 6th on the list. And all I really need to do is to add some context to a few of the feats I've already gone over. If Kisame can steal a large amount of chakra from an opponent, that almost assures a game over for them. And not only do they get weaker, but he also gets that much stronger, and the whole chakra absorption thing has always been treated as a dangerous technique in Naruto. Then there's his durability, which all I need to say here is that he survived being hit directly with Hiradora. Maybe you could make a case for someone like Kakuzu surviving this attack as well, but to be honest, I don't really see anyone below Kisame surviving an attack this ridiculously strong. And lastly, there's the jutsu at his disposal, and even glossing over most of his water-style arsenal, I don't think that anyone lower than Kisame on this list has an answer to the Super Shark Bomb jutsu. In keeping with my theme of placing alternate placements, though, I could see placing Kisame higher on this list, and honestly, this is about as low as I could possibly place him in the first place. Like I said when I started talking about him, most people seem to have him at 4th place, and I even used to agree with this, so if you want to put him that high, I would totally understand. Moving on to my number 5 pick, I have Konan. This is probably my most controversial pick on the list, and if I'm being totally honest, she's probably the most debatable on the whole list. I've heard people say she's the weakest Akatsuki member, and due to a lack of feats from her, it's hard to say exactly where to rank her. But I really wanted to bring attention to just how strong Konan is, given what we've seen of her, so I decided to really make a case for her today, and put her as high on the list as I thought I could justify. You could probably call bias on me here, but I am still trying to be honest with Konan's placement. I just also don't want to get swept into putting her lower on the list than she should be due to what seems to be the community's bias against her. So, getting right into why I have Konan so high on this ranking, I can cut to the chase and say that she pretty much only has feats from her fight with Obito. Unfortunately, we don't have any physical feats from Konan, so we don't know how strong or fast she is, but the feats we do have from her are honestly pretty ridiculous. And if you don't believe me, just go rewatch her fight with Obito. I promise she's more impressive than you remember. The first thing she does in her fight against Obito is launch a barrage of paper shuriken at him, which of course he's able to dodge because, well, he's Obito and he has the Kamui at his disposal. But already this barrage of shuriken would probably be troublesome for someone like Hidan. Then she gets caught by Obito in the middle of this same barrage, which looks bad until you realize that it was indeed her plan to get caught here and attempt to blow Obito to pieces along with herself. And she almost succeeds in doing this, so this makes Obito lose half of his mask and an entire arm in the resulting explosion. Then she proceeds to open up an entire freaking ocean below his feet and make him fall into the chasm she just created. No problem, right? He'll just use Kamui to get out. Nope, she anticipated this and has 600 billion paper bombs fall onto the guy and keep him trapped in an explosion that lasts a full 10 minutes. Most fights in the series aren't even 10 minutes long if we're considering how cinematic time works, and this is just one attack that she's using. Of course, after this, she's almost completely out of chakra, but considering what she accomplished here, I think it's safe to say that even among the Akatsuki, Konan is pretty impressive just for this. She did have prep time coming into this fight, but I feel that it would be somewhat fair to afford some prep time to Konan if you were going to make her fight other members of the organization, since she's got intel about plenty of the group's members and has the personality type to prepare for her fights anyway. I mean, she was smart enough to figure out an effective counter to Kamui, which is in contention for the strongest jutsu in the whole series. And when I say an effective counter, I mean she actually managed to kill Obito in this fight, and he had to use Izanagi to escape certain death. She managed to tear this man to pieces in just a few moments of fighting him, and he was only not taking her seriously for just a few seconds at the beginning of the fight. Of course, this fight with Obito wouldn't mean much if he wasn't an impressive opponent, but given that I obviously have him higher up the list than Konan and most of the rest of the Akatsuki, and also that a lot of people think that even Orange Mask Obito is the strongest member of the Akatsuki, I think it's fair to say that these feats are pretty impressive. I don't want to keep just hammering it away at the same points over and over here, but I do want you to ask yourself, as honestly as you can, if you think anyone I've placed lower on this list could do as well in the same matchup, even if they got as much prep time as Konan did. Moving on to my number 4 slot, I have Deidara. This probably isn't surprising anyone that I have Deidara here at this point. Maybe some people think I have him too high on this list, but I at least shouldn't have to explain why he's not in the top 3, right? But honestly, if you need it explained to you as to why Deidara is in the top half of the middle Akatsuki members, I just don't know how to help you, man. The guy is an absolute monster, and his main arsenal is so cracked that most ninja in the entire series would either outright lose to him in a fight, or at the very least, they'd have to struggle an awful lot against him. So Deidara's arsenal is obviously centered around his explosive clay, which sounds a little more limiting than it is at face value. Using this clay, Deidara is able to make clones of himself. He can set up area denial with his weird little cricket things. He can make homing missiles fly. He can make heavy artillery so intense that a single one of his bombs threatened to level almost the entire hidden sand village. I would certainly hope I don't need to go into depth about why Deidara's destructive capabilities put him this high on the list, but what about the rest of his arsenal? Well, we see that Deidara is at least fast enough in the air to contend with both Gaara and Onoki, who are 2 Kage-level opponents and should be at least in the same league as the Raikage in terms of speed due to their scaling in the war arc. He was comfortable in running away from both Naruto and Kakashi at the same time, and was even capable of dodging around and slipping away from all of both Team Kakashi and Team Guy at the same time. This last feat I mentioned brings me onto another line of scaling that I never see people talk about, and that's how ridiculously talented Deidara must be if he's able to contend with 2 full teams of Leaf Shinobi that contains a Jinchuriki, 3 Jonin, and 3 Chunin, and what's more, he did this in a Taijutsu scuffle, which is easily Deidara's weakest area of combat, and even more, he did this without using almost any of his clay explosives because he was down to his very last bit of it, and he had no arms. Like, seriously, this is a ludicrous feat from him, and while he still was trying to just run away from the group he couldn't properly fight against, he managed to almost kill all of them with just 1 attack when he detonated the clay clone at the end of the fight. I'll reiterate here that this group of enemies contained not only Chunin and Jonin, but Guy and Kakashi as well, who are the 2 top Jonin in the entire Hidden Leaf Village. And he would have killed all of them if it wasn't for the fact that Kakashi had Kamui to suck away the explosion. Deidara is firmly at least Kage level, since we see him fight well against the Tsuchikage and beat Gaara, the Kazekage, in individual battles. His individual attacks are lethal to most people if they get hit by them. He can fly, which I won't spend too much time on, but I do think is an extremely powerful ability since it makes him so much harder to pin down. And if he uses C4 in a fight against any of the other members of the Akatsuki that I've placed below him, they should just die, with the exception of Sasori and possibly Konan if she's using her sacred paper emissary jutsu that turns her body into paper. And then both C3 and C0 should be more than strong enough to wipe out any member of the group below him as well. Like I said, Deidara is an absolute monster, and I really hope people don't still think he's weak like they used to. And speaking of people thinking Deidara is weak, I want to wrap up talking about him by dispelling two of the common things people use to downplay him. The first of these is that Deidara's own confession that Sasori is stronger than him. I really don't have anything new to say about this, but my personal opinion is that Deidara was lying here to get Kakashi away from him in Naruto. His exact words are, "I probably shouldn't say something like this, but Sasori's stronger than me." Probably. Yeah. Which sounds so uncertain, even if he is telling the truth, that there's clearly room for debate on the topic. The second debunk I need to make is about his fight with Sasuke. Of course, Deidara did lose this fight, but this loss isn't as bad as some people make it out to be. Sasuke's strength at this point in the series is still a point of contention even today, and while I don't think that Sasuke is Sannin level during the Hebi days, I've heard some people argue that he would be able to beat Jiraiya this early in the series. And just because Sasuke isn't Sannin level, in my opinion, it doesn't mean that Deidara losing to him makes him weak or anything. I don't think that Deidara is supposed to be Sannin level at this point either, and I think that the same is true for the 5 people below him on this list, so at best for each of them, I think it's fair to say that you could scale them at Kage level. At worst for Deidara, this means that he lost to someone on a similar level of power to himself. But then there's also the fact that Sasuke was probably the worst opponent he could possibly have faced. Sasuke was faster on the ground than Deidara, could match his ability to fly, had lightning style to disable clay explosives, and had the Sharingan to cast stronger than normal genjutsu on Deidara, and he could even see the hidden bombs underground and the microscopic bombs in the air from C4, something none of the other Akatsuki members could do. Sasuke was essentially Deidara's perfect counter, and still to this day, I know people who think that the way Sasuke managed to survive the final attack was a total deus ex machina. So no, losing to Sasuke isn't an anti-feat by any means. In fact, I think you could probably use this fight to make Deidara look good, since he was able to fight so closely with someone who had the perfect counter to every one of his abilities. Getting into the final 3 now, and I think it comes as no surprise to anyone that I have Itachi, Obito, and Pain at the top of the list. Aside from a select few people who think that Kakuzu could beat Pain, I don't think I've ever seen anyone contest that these are the 3 strongest men in the Akatsuki. And I'm in trouble here, since I have to put them in an order that makes sense and that I can defend. I also don't want to make this too long, since this has already been a long enough discussion, and I think that matching the 3 of the big dogs in Akatsuki against each other is easily worthy of their own videos. But I also don't want to skimp on my explanations here, so just bear with me if I make a claim that I don't elaborate on quite enough for you. I have a lot to go over, and I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. I'll put the ranking aside for a moment and start analyzing Itachi first out of this group, since he comes first alphabetically. I don't believe I clarified this earlier in the video, but I will be taking Itachi's illness into account here. But even with that in mind, the man is just a force of nature. To put simply, Itachi has one of the single best movesets to take on one-on-one fights in the entire series. He may have the best genjutsu ability we see of anyone who isn't on 6 Paths level. He is able to defeat Orochimaru with only a single genjutsu and a kunai knife. And that's to say nothing of Tsukuyomi, which is, unless I've missed something, the only genjutsu in the entire series with a confirmed kill to its name if you take the novels into account. He has some of the most potent offense with the Amaterasu and Totsuka blade wielded by Susanoo, both of which are techniques which are supposed to be able to be a guaranteed kill if they hit the opponent. I will point out, though, that both Obito and Nagato have survived being hit by Amaterasu, which, while I still think it's a valuable tool in his kit, makes it less of a win condition in a fight against the other 2 top dogs of the Akatsuki. Itachi's Shuriken Jutsu is possibly the best in the entire series as well, and by combining it with his fire style, he's even able to pose a bit of a threat to be with it. Itachi is fast enough to keep up with characters like KCM Naruto and Sage Kabuto, and is physically strong enough to block swings of the Samehada by both B and Kisame if you take the video game cutscenes into account. Like, seriously, by watching any scene that Itachi is in, you get the idea that there's just nothing he can't do, and it's hard to imagine him losing to anyone except potentially either Pain or Obito. I know I had to use some feats from the war arc here, and I usually try to avoid doing that, but in this case I feel it's justified because 1, Itachi is never seen going all out, so even in the war arc we don't know what his full strength is, and 2, I do think it's possible to explain that Itachi's sickness didn't make him as weak as some people think. So getting into that sickness more, we see that during the fight with Sasuke, he's coughing up blood just randomly. He sweats almost the whole time, even though he likely hasn't physically exerted himself very much, especially since most of the first half of the fight took place in Genjutsu. He's unable to dodge shrapnel from Sasuke's rigged shuriken, and he's even on the verge of blindness here, and yet I've claimed that his illness isn't going to be too much of a detriment in this ranking. This is because, despite being on his literal deathbed to the point of dying possibly on the same day he would have, even if he hadn't battled Sasuke, Itachi's still able to pull off some pretty crazy stuff. He was able to cast all 3 of his Mangekyo Sharingan jutsu in the span of a single fight, and it's possible he used the Amaterasu more than one time since we see it ignite multiple times during the battle. He uses Tsukuyomi for basically no reason other than to intimidate Sasuke, and he manages to fully manifest his armored Susanoo for long enough after a relatively lengthy battle to still fight Orochimaru in what is the rough equivalent of Sage Mode and still keep up the jutsu afterwards to keep trolling Sasuke until he finally just dies of his illness, not from any wounds he suffered during the battle. I also need to address that even though it's stated that Itachi has stamina problems, he's still able to fight for a pretty long time using several majorly draining techniques while in the midst of a heart attack and still put pressure on Sasuke for a pretty long fight. And this is Itachi holding back too so as not to kill Sasuke, so it's fair to say that his stamina should hold out long enough for him to possibly get either Obito or Pain with some sort of an attack before he runs out of stamina. I'm not claiming he'd win an endurance battle with the two of them, but he should last long enough that he can accomplish something. Especially if we consider that this Itachi could be taken from any point between part 1 and before his fight with Sasuke. He could not necessarily be knocking on death's door. Like, it's not like he was going to die any given day. That is to say that he won't necessarily be in the worst shape of his life in this scenario. Moving on to analyzing Obito, and we've got someone a bit more straightforward. I am using Orange Mask Obito in this video, like I said earlier, and so his main shtick is that he's able to use the Kamui both offensively and defensively to a nearly flawless degree, but other than that, he doesn't use very many techniques. I just want to make it clear he probably does have other techniques at this point, but since we don't see him use any in the Orange Mask, I'm going to keep him in character here and say that he probably won't be using many other jutsu. As I mentioned earlier, many people think that Obito is the strongest man in the Akatsuki, and there is good reason for this. Kamui is without a doubt the strongest individual jutsu in the entire series. It makes a skilled user of the jutsu borderline immortal since they can just phase through anything, and Obito is able to win almost any fight with just one successful attack. I will mention, though, that the majority of the time Obito is in the Orange Mask and claiming to be Madara, it seems as though he mostly remains passive because he isn't as powerful as Madara once was. It's my own personal theory here that this was supposed to be the case and that Obito wasn't supposed to be much of a strong fighter in the Orange Mask, but this later changes when he gets the Rinnegan from Nagato's body and puts on the White Mask. The reason I claim that Orange Mask Obito was probably supposed to be relatively weak is because of a few of his strange behaviors around the 5 Kage Summit arc. In this arc, we see him pay a surprise visit to Naruto, and here he has the perfect opportunity to take Naruto away at this point and get one step closer to his final goal, but he just doesn't do it for whatever reason. And even if you want to claim he thought he could win the fight against Naruto, Kakashi, and Yamato, it's still strange that he didn't even attempt anything here. Then later on the same arc, we see him sit back and observe Sasuke's fights with the various Kage. He expressly states later in the day that his goal in coming to the 5 Kage Summit was to take the various Kage hostage and use them to bargain for the remaining Jinchuriki. He doesn't even try to grab a single one of them though, and if he was as strong as people think he is, I would think he'd at least be able to get one or two of them without Sasuke weakening them as much as he thought. I think because of this strange non-confrontational behavior that I think Obito may be a bit weaker than the community seems to think he is. Then the last of the big three is Pain, and I'm hoping I don't need to explain how ridiculously powerful he is. He is easily the most physically powerful member of the Akatsuki due to the abilities of the Diva Path's Almighty Push and Planetary Devastation. He can steal people's souls, revive the dead, summon some of the strongest summoning animals we've ever seen in this series. He shares vision among the 6 bodies for a full 360-degree scope of vision. He can control gravitational forces, absorb chakra, and negate jutsu, and can even launch mechanical assaults with the Ashura Path in the form of missiles and lasers and such. At the time he's introduced, he is by far the character with the strangest and possibly deadliest arsenal at his disposal. His first fight is him absolutely dominating one of the legendary Sannin, and he even manages to fight an entire ninja village with minimal help from his teammate. With all 3 of these characters having such a high level of power among them, how do I even begin to go about ranking them? Well, for starters, I have a caveat or two about my ranking. Since the 3 of them are all so close together in power, I am fully aware of the validity of other arguments than mine, and my final ranking of these 3 mostly comes down to my own personal opinion. I could honestly also easily call this a 3-way tie, or declare some sort of like a rock, paper, scissors situation in which one character beats another, who beats the other, who beats the first. But I'm not going to do that. I set out to rank the Akatsuki, and that's what I'm going to do. So at number 3, I have Obito. As I've already explained, he's obviously incredibly strong, but due to him having a bad matchup with Pain, admitting that Itachi may be able to kill him, and having some strange inconsistencies in his character during the 5 Kage Summit, I feel I need to place this version of Obito at number 3. If I had to briefly explain why I think it's likely he would lose to the other 2 here, it mostly comes down to the fact that I think Itachi is smart enough to figure Kamui out and devise a counter to it, and Pain having 6 bodies means that Obito gets put into serious danger if he starts sucking up the other paths during a fight against the remaining 6 paths of Pain. Once again, this ranking is incredibly close and subjective, but I'm going to leave it there for today. At number 2, I have Pain. I feel certain that I will make another video of Sick Itachi versus Pain at some point, but I will say that Pain's main win conditions in this fight, at least in my mind, are the chaotic Shinra Tensei and the Chibaku Tensei, neither of which do I think he'd get a solid opportunity to use in a fight against Itachi, who could likely destroy all 6 paths of Pain before his own stamina runs out. Then obviously at number 1, I have Itachi. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't think Itachi is the most straightforwardly powerful man in the Akatsuki, nor do I think he has a decisive victory over either Pain or Obito. But I do have a few reasons to place him all the way up here at the top. For one, there are some lines of scaling you can make with Itachi and like Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan Sasuke that both Orange Mask Obito and Pain just don't have the feats or scaling to measure up to. Then there's the fact that Itachi always holds back, which means that he should be stronger than any of the feats we have for them seem to imply. Albeit this is to a completely unquantifiable and arbitrary degree, it should still be true that he's stronger than he appears. And lastly, I think his arsenal is just the most well-rounded out of the 3 for taking on singular opponents. If we were discussing who would do better against a large army of enemies, I think Pain would take this, no question, but we're not discussing who does more damage on a battlefield, but rather who is stronger than the other members of the Akatsuki. So to wrap things up, I want to turn it to you guys. I'm sure if this video gets even a few views, there will be a lot of you guys who don't agree with everything I've said in this video. If that's the case and you're feeling heated about it, please leave me a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts on anything I've said in this ranking. Other than that, I hope all you guys enjoyed this massive dissertation of a video, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Until then, stay safe, have a good day, goodbye.